If you are looking for a political memoir that tells the story of an up-and-coming Republican, then today's book just might be for you. Today I will be covering Hillbilly Elegy by JD Vance. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we're taking a look at a book that is actually about 8 years old. However, I think because of the current political moment, it is a very relevant book. A lot of people have been asking questions about the newest vice presidential nominee for the Republicans, and that is JD Vance. However, that also complicates trying to cover this book because this book, it came out when JD Vance was just over 30, and although I think a lot of his political ideology was already developed, or at least was developing, he was a very different person for a lot of reasons than the person he is today. And it's really hard to cover this without acknowledging the fact that a lot of people have had a lot of things to say about JD Vance, both the good and the bad, with a lot of the current pundits mostly making fun of him. Since I don't really want to engage in that conversation specifically, what I do want to do is give a quick synopsis of the book. Although I think most people are pretty familiar with what's in it, I think the little blurb that people usually associate with JD Vance is a pretty good synopsis of this book. I do then want to take a look at some of the criticisms and evaluate whether I think they're fair criticisms or whether I think they're a little overdone. The synopsis that, again, I think everyone is pretty familiar with is that JD Vance was born in Ohio in a small town, a deindustrialized town, and he was predominantly raised by his grandparents, his mom's mother in particular. His mom's father also played a part, but especially his mom's mother. And he did spend some time with his mother growing up, although, as everyone is well aware, she had struggles with various dependencies on substances, both legal and illegal. And his relationship with his dad was a little strange. That's something that he tries to track in the book, but he actually jumps around a fair amount in respect to his relationship with his father. So that one's a little harder to fully flesh out, but that is another part of his upbringing that you can find in this book. In the book, he details what it was like. He details all sorts of interesting stories about his mother and his grandma. His mother, it's usually negative stories, whether it's moments where he didn't feel like he was taking care of her. He tells one incident where he says she threatens his life, trying to kill him by crashing the car, and herself being in and out of recovery programs meant that there were times where she just couldn't take care of him. And there's even one year where he lives with essentially strangers. And it's not until his second year in high school that he finally gets some real stability by living with his grandmother. And that's one of the biggest things that he emphasizes throughout the book, is that the stability of his sophomore, junior, and senior year is the thing that set him up to be much more successful. He did not do great in school before that. He did not have really good grades. And obviously the inconsistency of where he would be living would be the prime source of that, at least one thing that most people would point to, and I think rightfully so. And then he details going into the Marine Corps, which is something that appears to have given him a whole lot in his life. In addition to the GI Bill giving him money to go to Ohio State for undergrad, it also played a big role in helping him understand his own identity, and it gave him a great deal of discipline that was a big part of his success at Ohio State. Of course, doing well at Ohio State is what helps him to get into Yale Law School, and he is on the law review, and he meets his future wife there, and all this is meant to be essentially the culminating event of someone who came from a clearly impoverished background. Those are the main points of the book. Now, as to some of the criticisms that I do think are worth addressing. First and foremost, there are some people who have criticized the fact that it's called a hillbilly elegy, and he tries to associate himself with Appalachia, even though he himself is not from Appalachia. His grandmother is, and his grandmother does play a big role in his life. I wouldn't say, though, reading the first portion of the book, that he tries too hard to apply the term hillbilly or this association with Appalachia. That seems to be something that he does much more so after coming out of his hometown. When he goes into the Marines is the first time that you hear him talk more about being a hillbilly, or when he's in Ohio State or at Yale is where he talks more about being a hillbilly. So this seems to be an association that he is much more drawn to once he's no longer in the small and deindustrialized community in which he grows up. Another criticism would be that he seems to blame the people of Ohio for being impoverished. And there are a few instances of this in the book where he does appear to say that people's conditions have much more to do with their own laziness than it has to do with any larger systemic issues. I think it's pretty easy to see why that could be a controversial take. However, he doesn't do it so much that it's easy to really address. He just picks a few select people and he uses those as his examples of why things are the way they are. And that's a lot harder to discuss because you can find lazy people anywhere you go. So that can be really hard to engage with a larger conversation. Because on the contrary, his own family, which appears to have lots of problems, he never calls any of them lazy. He insists on the fact that they are actually very hardworking. They just might be untraditional in a lot of different ways. I do think that some of his criticisms of calling the people where he grew up lazy a bit problematic. Not because it's not possibly true, but simply because he tries to give examples, but then I think he falls short in giving it actual supportive information. And so instead he's just using this anecdotal evidence, which I think is problematic when you're trying to have a much larger discussion on what has caused these areas of the country to be so poor. On top of that, one of my big issues with his assessment, and this seems to be a relatively common trope that I find in books like this, where you have a rags to riches story, especially if the person has a much more conservative political bent, and that is that a rags to riches story ignores the larger question of rags to middle class. And so he has a very common story where he talks about being at a dinner where he doesn't know which spoon to use, and how he felt a little out of the loop when he was at Yale because he came from a poor family. And I have to say, I find that story stupid. And I'm sorry, JD Vance, I don't know you personally, but I find that story stupid whenever someone tells that story, because the vast majority of Americans that consider themselves middle class still cannot relate to that story. That's just not something that we should be having a protracted conversation about. What we should be having protracted conversations about is getting people from the lower class to the middle class. So this idea of someone going from the lower class to the upper class, I just don't fully connect with that. And I don't think it's all that helpful when we're trying to discuss what kinds of policies and laws we should be enacting to make it more possible. And so that's one of those times where I just felt like he was making the wrong argument. But it's not like he gives a ton of arguments or policy ideas. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things I found pretty lacking in this book. By and large, his success story comes from the fact that he had a grandmother that gave him great stability, and that the Marines managed to give him a whole lot more opportunities in his life, both of which I think are very important things to point out. And I do think it's worth noting that he has had a lot of success for someone that really came from a very problematic background. That being said, I do not think that simply going from poor to rich means that you are the best person to give explanations as to what future policies should be, because policies and your own experiences are not one and the same, although they certainly can inform each other. So I do think that his overall assessment, although valid because it's his own experience, may also be lacking some really key questions of not trying to get everyone that is poor to be rich, but just trying to fill out the middle class. And I would say that's probably the biggest weakness of this book that I found. So who is this book for? That's really hard to answer. Obviously, a lot of people are going to have a lot of opinions on him, not just because he's the running mate of Donald Trump, but I think a lot of people over the years have slowly been building more and more opinions on him because of just some of the things he said and done. That being said, I do find his story in and of itself impressive, at least up to a certain point. I would say there are going to be those things which I disagree with him on, but as a whole, I do think there is much to be learned. So anyone that's looking for that element of his life, you'll find it. If you're looking for a detailed discussion of policies and ideas, that's not in this book. Also, I will say he definitely uses a lot of salty language, usually because it is describing a story from his grandma, which, by the way, that seems to be the bulk of this book. He seems to have written this book mostly so he could tell stories about his grandmother, some of which funny, some of which tragic. And I would say that if that is not going to interest you, or you're going to have a problem with the language, then this book might not be for you. There's no way that I can recommend or not recommend this book without there being some kind of political implication. And I really would encourage people to be very thoughtful about whether they would want to read this book or not, regardless of the current situation with JD Vance. But that is completely up to you, and I don't blame anyone that does or doesn't want to read this book. I can see arguments both ways, and it is totally up to an individual whether they want to better understand a man that wants to be our future vice president. But that's all I can really say about that. If you have a difference of opinion, which I'm sure many people do, please kindly let me know some of your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.